Chapter 5 Maid of the Mist. I didn't even hear the bell ring or notice that my horrid classmates were gone. I could feel Clarice rubbing my shoulder. Mrs. Needham called from way off. Miss Johnson, wait outside. Miss Malone, sit up. Are you all right? I wanted to say, other than having my life destroyed by your A minus, I'm fine, thank you. But I raised my head. No, ma'am. What did you think about my comments? I sniffled, smoothed my essay on my desk, and looked down to see what she'd written. We have discussed this many times before, Miss Malone. In the future, give your thesaurus a break. One more session like this, and that poor book will burst into flames. Good writing is simple and communicates naturally. Your past work has shown this is something you can easily do. I appreciate that you are not digressing as much. As for this essay, when I ask for 2 pages, that's all I will accept. I'm aware how upsetting this will be. A point is being made, and this shouldn't be a complete surprise. This will be the most important paper you have ever written. Please see me after class. Mrs. Needham said, Well? I wiped my eyes on the back of my hand. You said this is the most important paper I've ever written. Depending upon how you react, I believe it could be. I looked at the red minus sign that looked like a tiny bloody slash cut into my work and my soul by a razor of hate. But I worked so long and hard. Why did I get A minus? Deza, come here. This day was getting stranger and stranger. She had never called any of us by our first name. Mrs. Needham sat at Benny Cobb's desk. Have a seat, Deza. I started to sit next to her, but she said, No, there, and pointed at the chair behind her desk. Really? Miss Malone, sit. The old saying that every cloud has a silver lining is true. I'd pretended a million times that I was sitting here and giving my unappreciative, hard headed students a lesson. I had even lifted buckets of rocks at home a couple of times with Jimmy to build muscles so I could call Dolly Peaches and Benny Cobb to the front of the class, then mercilessly beat them into bloody pulps with a yardstick for embarrassing and bullying their classmates and not trying hard enough on their work. I'd imagined that many years from now I'd pick one of my favorite students, maybe it would be Clarice's daughter, to work a problem on the blackboard. The chair had burgundy leather and buttons and was cool and smooth on the back of my legs. I looked at the classroom and forgot all about that red grade. Well, pretty much forgot. Mrs. Needham said, I know being a teacher is your ambition, Deza, and a fine one it is, but I can see you as a professor or, if we can pry the dictionary out of your hands, even as a writer. I wiggled and the chair swiveled from side to side. Only the tips of my toes were touching the floor, but it felt perfect. Deza, I have been teaching longer than you could imagine, and I have always had the dream any teacher worth her salt has. I had thought prior to this year that I would have to be satisfied in coming close to the dream once before. Alas, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee. The dream is the gift of having one student, just one, who is capable of making a real contribution. One child who would have no choice but to make a difference for our people. Out of the thousands of students I've had in the thousands of years I've been teaching, I've suspected for quite a while who that child I've been waiting for is. All I could think was, I love her like a sister, but please just don't say Clarice. Miss Malone, you are that child. I stopped wiggling. That's why I gave you the A minus, Deza. And it won't be the last if you're not up on your P's and Q's. Any more grandstanding in your writing, there might even be a B or two down the road. Remember, much is required of her to whom much has been given. My heart flew like a rocket ship. These are trying times for the whole country, Miss Malone, and I'm aware that you have been dealt a pretty rough hand. But, child, with your gifts, you are the richest person I have ever had the honor of teaching. I believe from the bottom of my heart that if we lose you, we've lost this country. If we can't get you to your true path, it's the failure of everyone, from President Roosevelt right down to me. And while President Roosevelt is far too busy to give a hoot, I have nothing but time on my hands. I will not sit idly by and see you fall. I understand that you are the reason I've taught for all these years. We are both in the right spot at the right time. Goosebumps danced all over my arms. Oh, Mrs. Needham, I can do whatever needs to be done. Jimmy's always saying if I read one more book or study one more minute, my brain will explode out of my eyes. But I can work harder. Your words are like manna produced from heaven to me. I hope I pronounced manna the right way. Mrs. Needham's eyes rolled. Oh, for the love of Pete. The first thing I have to do is wrench that dictionary and thesaurus out of your hands. And we're going to have to work on the way you react to bad news. You have to toughen up, Missy, but we'll get by. Yes, ma'am. As you know, the board is forcing me to retire this year. So what I'd like to do is have you come to my home every day after school, the weekends for private tutoring. The work here is not challenging enough for you, but I'll take care of that. It was like she was reading my mind when she said, "We'll include Clarice if you'd like." Mrs. Needham almost smiled. My eyes swelled with tears. I wanted to run around the desk and give her a hug, but she looked like she'd eaten a piece of bad fish when Clarice hugged her. "Oh, thank you. Clarice will be just as happy as me. But could I ask you, what does the thing you said earlier about gangs mean?" Gangs? Oh, it was gang after glee. That's from Burns, my favorite Scottish poet. We'll be studying him later. The poem is called To a Mouse. Mrs. Needham closed her eyes. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. I didn't understand a bit of it. Mrs. Needham said, Mr. Burns wrote this after he was plowing his field and accidentally destroyed a mouse nest. He tells the mouse that even though his home is ruined, it's still better off than most humans because the mouse only looks at the present, while people look to the past and end up being sad or look to the future and end up worrying. No matter how well a mouse or a human being plans for the future, those plans gang after glee. In other words, no matter how well you think something through, many times schemes simply will not work out. They will go astray. I already knew this, but I could never have said it like a poem. It sounded like something Father would say. By the way, a former student of mine is graduating from Meharry Dental School and plans on returning to Gary. I have prevailed upon him to take you on in September, once he's officially a dentist and starts practicing. A dentist? But my teeth don't bother me. Not too much. Mrs. Needham looked at me long enough to make me a little nervous. A thorough checkup won't hurt. I wondered how she knew that my teeth can be a little sore some of the time, especially the back ones that are all hollowed out by cavities. She'd said this new dentist was just starting to practice. I'd rather wait until he started working for real. But I said, Thank you very much, ma'am. You're quite welcome, Deza. Now, open the right bottom drawer of my desk and remove the bag, please. I put a crumply brown paper sack on her desk. Take out what's inside, please. Inside the bag, there was a beautiful pair of new patent leather shoes and some folded up clothes. Mother says it's rude to get shoes on anything but the floor, so that's where I put them. Do you wear a size 5? I'm not sure. Try them on. I picked up the first shoe. There were some socks rolled up in it. Should I put on the socks too? Yes. I was glad I was behind her desk and she couldn't see my shoes and socks. My shoes are quite tired and my socks have been darned a million times. Jimmy says our socks and clothes are very religious because they are so holy. My hands were shaking, but I pulled the new socks on and slipped my feet into the shoes. I knew just how Cinderella felt. They were a little big, but maybe that was because mine were so tight. I sat on my I sat on my socks so Mrs. Needham wouldn't see them. She said, My niece from Cleveland spent the summer with me a while ago and left a few things. I thought they might fit you. Did Mrs. Needham really mean these shoes were for me? I walked out from behind the desk so she could see her niece's shoes. I'd never felt this tall. The right hand heel on my old shoes had fallen off. Jimmy tried to put it back on, but it wouldn't stay. He ended up pulling the left heel off so I wouldn't walk with a limp. Mrs. Needham said, What do you think? I've never seen such a beautiful pair of shoes, not even in a store window. Are they really going to let me have these? They may as well be put to good use. I'm going to save them until 7th grade. You don't need to save them. My niece left a few pairs of shoes and I'll give them to you as needed. Take them off and ask your parents if it's all right for you to accept them. Yes, ma'am. This horrible day was turning into the best day anybody ever had. Empty the bag, Miss Malone. I pulled out two brand new half slips and three pairs of blue underpants. The last thing I pulled out was even more beautiful and special than the shoes. I read this book about a place called Niagara Falls, which is a waterfall geologically located between the United States and Canada. The last thing in the bag made me think of it. The book said you could ride a boat called the Maid of the Mist right under these huge waterfalls that got covered with a cool mist the water made when it splashed on rocks. The last thing in the bag was just like the mist. It was a lovely soft blue gingham dress. I ran my hand over the dress. This was what it must feel like to ride the Maid of the Mist under the falls. I pressed my face into the gingham and found out how new smelled. I must have dreamed about this dress. It was so familiar. Hold it up and see if it fits. I squeezed it to me, then quickly pulled it back. It made my regular one look really, really old. There was a little piece of paper held onto the dress by a string and a safety pin. My hands were shaking like a leaf, and I read, Heimlock's fine apparel for ladies and gentlemen. Then I remembered. I had seen this dress before. Heimlock's is a rich people's clothes store. Me and Clarice walk by every day on the way home. We'd seen a dress just like this one in the big front window on one of those little white dummy girl statues. I fell in love with it, and Clarice fell in love with the green and gray dress that the dummy sister of my statue was wearing. Every day we passed Heimlich's, we'd imagine where we'd wear those two dresses. Once it was for going to a real restaurant and asking a stranger to cook us some food. Once for our graduating from college, and once for Clarice's wedding, where I was her maid of honor. The best thing we imagined was wearing them to Benny and Dolly's funeral. We'd wear veils so people would think we were crying, but we'd secretly be laughing about how rich and happy we looked while those hoodlums were put 6 feet under. The dresses disappeared from the windows in April, and we hated what took their place. I held the piece of paper. Mrs. Needham's brow wrinkled. Dear me, bring that here. She undid the safety pin. That silly child wore this all summer and never took the tags off. Thank you so much, Mrs. Needham. My throat betrayed me again. Be sure to ask your parents, Deza. They may contact me if there are any questions. Tell absolutely no one, not even Clarice, about my niece's clothes. Use that explosive imagination of yours to come up with a story. Now, be prepared for September. I can't wait. My hands were shaking even harder when I put my brand new clothes back in the sack. I went to my old desk, collected my books, and smoothed out my essay even more. The A minus wasn't so bad after all. I headed to the door and then turned back. Mrs. Needham, you'll never know. Deza Malone, one more peep out of you, and I will mail those clothes right back to Cleveland. Pull yourself together and go. I would have gone, but she held up two fingers, touched her cheek, held up one finger, and put her hand on her chest, like she was saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and she smiled. I knew I was risking my new clothes, but I dropped everything and ran back. She jumped up and made a face, but I wrapped my arms around her and held on tight. Mrs. Needham, I've always dreamed that one day I'd have the same heart as you, but I thought I'd have to wait until I got to be real old too. She let me cry before she got me arm's length away. Fine, Deza, now go home. I grabbed Mrs. Needham once more. The only thing that the best teacher in the world could say was, "Oh, for the love of Pete."